Good evening. My name is Linda Safford, and I'm with the Comox Valley Council of Canadians. I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the unceded territory of the Comox First Nation. I represent the Council of Canadians, and this event is co-sponsored by our local chapter, by the Comox Valley Conservation Partnership, the Comox Valley Global Awareness Network, the Freshwater Alliance, and the Watershed Sentinel. Welcome to our event. I would like to recognize a number of local government officials and candidates for the May 9th provincial election who are here. Mayor Leslie Baird of Cumberland, Rana Ray Leonard, NDP candidate for the election, Ernie Sellington, the Green candidate for the election. And if there are any other government officials or candidates, would you please stand, because we didn't get your name at our check-in table. Okay, they'll be coming later, I'm sure. The agenda this evening, we're going to be welcomed by the Comox First Nation Kamugway dancers and singers, and I'm going to turn the table over to them.
Gaila Kasla, Hamatla Lokalatle, Gaila Kasla, Nuquam Kumhilagilis, Gayutla Comox. On behalf of the Comox First Nation, I'd like to welcome you all here onto traditional unceded Comox First Nation territory. We'd like to start out by welcoming you all here in the ways of our ancestors. And we would like to sing and dance a welcome dance for you. Gaila Kasla. ancestors have lived here in the Comox Valley since time immemorial. Our people have always relied on the waterways for transportation to get from one village to the next, to visit our relatives in other villages. And we've also relied on the fresh water supplies that flow through our communities. They've sustained us by providing us with food and drinking water for thousands upon thousands of years. And we've come to realize in this day and age the threat to our waterways, the threat to our water resources that flow through our community. These same river systems that sustained our ancestors, the same lakes and rivers and streams that sustained our ancestors, sustain each and every one of us today. And we all come together when these things start to get threatened. And the smart ones amongst us are starting to realize that we have to speak up now, because too much is going on in this world that we have to take notice. We have to protect what has been given to us by our Creator. The reason that the Creator put us in this place, we have a responsibility to give back and to make sure that those same waterways, those same rivers and streams and lakes are protected. And the trend, as many of you know, in recent years has been against protection. Different governments are coming in, not just in British Columbia or Canada, but as you know, in the United States and other parts of the world, that are threatening our waterways and making way for big corporations to dictate what's going to happen to our waterways. And they want to shove that kind of stuff down our throat, and we're not going to let this happen. And so we come together as Indigenous people to say that we're in support of everything that needs to be done to protect our waterways, to protect our natural resources, to protect our traditional ways of life, our traditional values of this land, of this territory, and to support people in other territories that have those same cultural values as we have. So we're happy to be here today to lend our support, and we'd like to sing one more song as we leave. And we've been told that our ancestors were always would sing about our landscape, sing about our environment, about our mountains and the ocean and different things. But we have one song amongst our people, amongst Comox, and it's called the River Song. And this one pays respect to the river that flows just behind us, that flows through our community. And we know in recent years what it's been like to be hit by drought, something that we never used to have to experience ever. And we know what it's like to not have snowpack on the mountains. And so we sing these songs to the environment to show our respect that we have for our river. This is the River Song. Thank you for listening to my words.
Like an Kaso we ya hey ya we ya hey ya we dana kaso
Kaila Kasla, thank you.
So a very, very big thank you to the Comox singers. That was a wonderful way to start our gathering tonight to consider what's happening in the Comox Valley and in the rest of the world around water. For people at the back, there are a couple of seats up front, I believe. If you're finding that you're too far away, you're welcome to move back up. So I want to do what is a complete pleasure for me. I actually never in my life imagined that I would be able to do this. I want to introduce Maud Barlow. Maud is an inspiration and a muse to people here and around the world, around the issues about water. You inspire us, you move us to action, and we're incredibly lucky to have you with us tonight. She's no stranger to the Comox Valley. Many of you have met her before. For those of you who don't know her, she's been the chair of the council, founder and chair of the Council of Canadians for, well, since sometime in the 80s, yes. And tonight she's speaking to us from her years of experience as one of the world's leading water warriors. Is it all right to call you a water warrior, Maud? Yeah. She was the, in 2008 and 2009, she was the advisor on water to the 63rd President of the United Nations General Assembly, and was a leader in the successful campaign that resulted in the United Nations recognizing water as a human right in 2010, which is a tremendous victory for people all around the world. She founded the Blue Planet Project that works internationally for the human right to water and has been key to the Blue Communities movement that now includes Comox, Cumberland, Paris, France, the World Council of Churches, Bern, Switzerland, and hopefully Berlin. The book she's speaking about tonight is in a series about water. It's the latest in 16 books that she's written. She's the recipient of many honorary doctorates and numerous awards and recognitions. I don't know how she does it, but her strength and her compassion and her knowledge continues to inspire so many of us. So Maud, we welcome you here tonight.
Can I put this down? Is that going to break anything? I don't want to break anything. Now I've already broken something.
Don't break it, you're fine.
All right, I am so pleased to be here, and I'm just feeling that that's a tiny bit high here. And I'm just going to do this. That's so you can hear me. All right. How's that? Is that better? Yeah, all right. No, I think we're good, Corey. First of all, thank you very much, Alice, for an absolutely beautiful introduction. Thank you to Alice and Corey for hospitality in your beautiful place. They pampered me and took care of me, and I just met Alice's 98-year-old father, Doug, who is a prince of a man who held my chair for me last night at dinner. So I just feel in the lap of luxury and love, and I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you very much to the Council of Canadian Steering Committee and to all the other wonderful organizations that have put tonight on. It's just tremendous. And Linda and everyone for the the work that you've done here tonight. And the Comox singers and dancers were absolutely marvelous and touched my heart. So just pleased as punch to be here. What we're trying to do on this tour is to have the issue of water become an election issue in the upcoming election here in British Columbia, and for us to start raising it the way people around the world are raising climate change, and to start having people understand that we can't just have this as a side issue, it's got to be more central. And in the work that I do, it feels to me that climate change is about 5 years ahead of the water curve, if you will, and people understanding it. When people talk about water and climate, they generally think of water as being a victim of climate change, which it is, of course. When you have warming atmosphere and you have runaway greenhouse gases, you are warming, you know, the temperature. That obviously affects our waterways and our aquatic life. But what we're much less understanding of, I believe, is how the way we treat water, how we remove it from where it belongs, where nature put it, how we mismanage it, how we pollute it, how we divert it, and so on, how we take it away in the form of what's called virtual water, so everything that you grow or produce is using water, and if you export that away, then you've exported the water right out of the watershed. We have not got this yet in our consciousness, and it is my firm belief that the way we treat water and the abuses of water, the problems of water, are at least as important as greenhouse gas emissions in the creation of climate change, and the solution to climate change is just as much about water as it is about greenhouse gas emissions. And that's one of my little goals in life, is to get that out there more in the world, because I think it's just tremendously important. We have a crisis, a global water crisis. There's absolutely no question about it. We have lack of access to clean water all over the world. The United Nations tells us that by 2035, demand for water will exceed supply by about 40%. Now, it's just very difficult to get our heads around what this actually means. As it is now, almost 1 billion people lack access to clean water, and 2.5 billion in our world don't have access to sanitation. I was in one slum in India where 5,000 people technically shared a toilet. So I mean, we have no idea in our lives what this is about. But when we have what I call the perfect storm of rising water rates, rising poverty and inequality, not just in the global south, but here in the global north, the so-called north as well, and then declining water tables, we have the perfect storm for a very serious situation coming. And the United Nations says that by 2075, the water crisis may be affecting as many as 7 billion people. That's right, 7 billion people. So it's extraordinarily important for those of us who have the gift of living in a water secure area of the world to be able to take care of our water, to recognize that we are stewards of this water and that we have a responsibility. Now, all of this is not just far away. It exists here in Canada as well. All of the issues in the global north are from what we've believed are the global south, are here in the global north. We have what I call the myth of abundance. We have abused our water terribly. We do not take care of it. You'll hear many people telling you that we have 20% of the world's water. That's only accurate if we were to drain every lake and river in Canada. We have about 6.5% of the world's available fresh water, and most of that is in mighty rivers running north. So for the vast majority of us who live along the Canada-US border, we have about 2.5%. So we do not have that amount of water that we've been all told we have. Climate change is changing and warming our lakes, Canadian lakes most of all, more than most around the world. Our glaciers are melting, every single one of them. Our Arctic lakes are disappearing. We have very poor protection of our groundwater. The image that I use that I think is helpful to people is you can imagine a group of people around a bathtub, each with a blindfold and a straw, and everybody's drinking from this bathtub, and it's fine. There's lots and lots of water until one day there's no water at all. And that's what's happening with the exponential overuse and lack of knowledge about what our groundwater sources are about. We have no national standards for drinking water. We have very poor national standards for wastewater. We are raising our forest, raising as in R-A-Z, destroying our forests and wetlands. And we're dumping chemicals, sewage, and herbicides and pesticides into our lands and onto our water. I'm struggling with this computer and everything's falling off. Thanks, Corey. It's just my papers are struggling here, and I'm struggling that with I'm struggling with that. That would be so good. Bless you. Thank you. All right, much better. Now I can see things. We are also placing fatal toxins in our blue-green algae in 246 lakes in Canada. Lake Winnipeg and Lake Erie are both very sick. And when I look at the plan to send more and more beef and pork to Europe through the new agreement that we've signed with Europe, the CETA, nobody's stopping and asking, well, do we have the water facility for that? What happens if we have more hog farms around Lake Winnipeg and so on? Nobody's asking these questions. And of course, the First Nations community around in Canada is in crisis as well, continues to be. 2/3 of all First Nations communities have been under a drinking water advisory in the last decade. So we have very serious issues here in our country. Successive federal governments have not asserted their constitutional authority, and so they've left it to the provinces, and in many cases, I would say pretty well in all cases, to the detriment of water and the right to water. And the last government, the Harper government, gutted the 3 most important water laws that we had. They gutted the Fisheries Act, they gutted the Navigable Waters Protection Act, and they gutted the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. And with these changes, basically federal protection for 99% of all of our lakes and rivers is gone. We have no protection whatsoever. I tell my American friends, it's as if the government killed the Clean Water Act, which Trump may very well do. He certainly cut all the funding to the Great Lakes and to many programs already, but it's as if you just cut all of the programs that you'd had for many decades. And now pipelines carrying explosive gas or tar sands bitumen loaded with chemicals like benzene and toluene can carry this stuff under, over, or around 31,000 lakes and 2.25 million rivers in Canada with absolutely no federal protection. The Trudeau government promised that they would reinstate these laws, and they set up consultation processes. 2 of them have come back. One is on the Fisheries Act, and the report is pretty good, and we're quite happy with what they're recommending, which doesn't mean we're going to get it, but what the consultation process came back with was good. On the Navigable Waters Protection Act, we're very unhappy. They're basically saying they're not going to touch it. In its essence, that communities will have to apply to have their lakes and rivers relisted to be protected. And this is because the big energy industry, the big construction industry, the mining industries and so on do not want these protections back for these waterways. We've yet to hear back from the process on the Canadian Environmental Assessment Project. So really we're just kind of in an in-between here, and we were promised that these would be reinstated, and it doesn't look like it's going to happen without a fight. So it's very important we get involved. So that brings me to British Columbia, beautiful British Columbia. As the singer said earlier, we have had extreme weather here for the first time in people's lives. Climate change, terrible drought, forest fires. We're experiencing here in British Columbia the kind of extreme weather that we know comes with climate change. But there are also serious new threats, or threats that are ongoing and growing, and I just want to list them. I know a lot of you know them, and I know you're working on them, but I think it's very important for us to put these together. Fracking, British Columbia has kind of become the fracking capital of Canada, along with Alberta, but basically east of Saskatchewan, there's basically very little fracking going on, and the fight has been really quite fierce, and I'm really hoping that we can up the ante here in British Columbia. There are 8 billion liters of water used by the fracking wells, the newer fracking wells here in BC every year, and there are going to be billions more liters of water at risk when the LNG terminals come on board, because they use and destroy a great deal of water as well. Then, of course, there's the Kinder Morgan Trans-Canada Pipeline, 890,000 barrels of tar sands crude a day. This will endanger 1,300 waterways from Alberta to the coast in Burrard Inlet. And will add many supertankers, perhaps as many as 400 each year, to operate in the inlet. This is a $7.4 billion operation that would triple the capacity of that pipe, and is a very grave danger. We know from other spills, the one in Kalamazoo, Michigan, that when this bitumen diluted with chemicals spills, it's not like a conventional oil spill. It doesn't stay on the top of the water. The chemicals evaporate into the air and destroy the health of any living thing around it, and the tarry substance falls to the bottom. And billions of dollars later, they're unable to clean up the mess in Kalamazoo. So we know that it's not a case of if it'll spill, it is only a case of when it'll spill. And I've documented in my book the number of spills just in Alberta alone, for instance, every single day. Or every single second or third day there's a spill of some kind. Then we have bottled water, which is not perhaps as threatening in the larger area, but more threatening in the specific areas. 83% of Canada's bottled water exports come from British Columbia. The project in Hope in that area, it takes 265 million liters every year. And of course, as you know, they're only paying $2.25 per million liters. Until last year, they weren't paying a cent. So this is that concept of thinking that we're so blessed with water that it's all right to take give it away for free. We've got a boycott with Nestle, and we really hope that you'll join us. Go to our website, Canadians.org. Punch in the Nestle boycott and join us, because we've got well over 50,000 people now who've pledged not to be drinking Nestle bottled water, or other bottled water for that matter. And this is a very bad company. You need to know that Peter Brabeck, who's the CEO of Nestle from Switzerland, is not only selling his Pure Life water around the world to the world's poor and to the world's rich, but he has a brand for the world's poor. But he also is advising the World Bank on water policy in the global south. So with one hat, he's saying to the World Bank, do not put money into public services, into public water, into accessible water, but put it into private for-profit services. And then as the CEO of Nestle, he's selling the water to anybody who people who can't access clean water from their taps. And I think that's actually the definition of evil. Then we have the Site C Dam in the Peace River Valley, and as you know, it would flood a massive area, about 100 square kilometers of boreal forest, and damage downstream river flows, would submerge 78 First Nations heritage sites and burial grounds. And agronomist Wendy Holm warns us that the water impounded behind the dam could become a NAFTA commodity, a very interesting concept she's put forward, if BC Hydro is privatized and American investors are involved, because she said this is just the route that those in the past have been talking about exporting our water south. We have many new and existing mines that threaten our water here in British Columbia in many ways. You know about Mount Polley, of course. It's a travesty that has not been acknowledged by the Clark government, to its shame. And it could happen again. It's very important that we understand that the public here was left with a $40 million cleanup. There's the Red Chris mine at the Sacred headquarters in Northwest BC. There's the Ajax mine in Kamloops. They would be producing 65,000 tons of ore per day for 18 years, a lot of it right in the city limits itself. They would use 15 billion liters of water per year from Kamloops Lake. A very serious set of mines, and when Christy Clark talks about job creation, this is all she's got in mind. It's back to drawers of water and hewers of wood. It's basically Canada's past. And you should know that in the late 1970s, early 80s, when they were first negotiating that first free trade agreement, manufacturing accounted for about 26% of our GDP. Today it accounts for only 10% of our GDP. So we've lost those manufacturing jobs over the years to these free trade agreements, to globalization, to the whole ability or giving over the ability to corporations to move their jobs offshore when they want to. And so we're left with not the kind of job opportunities that we had even decades ago. And this came from deliberate government policy. They wanted to move away from our just being dependent on our raw resources and building those secondary jobs. That's all gone by the wayside, and we really need to make this an issue again. Then we have logging, which you're going to hear more about in a few minutes, but Vancouver Island, the rate of logging of old growth forest has gone up 12% in less than a decade, and it really is an issue that affects water as well. As well, it's really important to note First Nations and their communities are targeted here in British Columbia and elsewhere. There were 544 boil water advisories in BC alone last year, and most of these projects that I'm talking about especially endanger First Nations communities and territories. And I want to say that in all my years of activism, I have never seen such incredible leadership being shown by First Nations here in BC particularly, but across the country, but here in BC particularly. And just I just really want to say how important that is, and how solidarity with First Nations showing this leadership is incredibly important for our movement. Now, the Clark government brought in its Water Sustainability Act, and they said, we are addressing some of the issues we've been hearing from you. And there were some improvements in regulation of groundwater and inclusion of environmental flows to ensure supply. But they are extending the concept of first in time, first in right that now exists for surface water to groundwater. And this is a real problem because it basically gives preferential treatment to those who got there first, regardless of what they're using the water for. There are 20,000 wells that are being used by industry, largely by industry in this province, and they will be largely protected. They will get first rights. And this is the wrong way. This is the wrong way to be looking at how we manage water. What we need to collectively do is say, how much water do we have? How sustainable is it? How can we come together to decide on priority access, who should have access and who should not? When you take a look at a world running out of water, and you realize that we can deliver safe, clean water out of taps to people here, there should be no place for allowing bottled water takings, whether the company pays highly or not at all for it. I think we need to have very clear guidelines. And I worked with the people in Vermont, the beautiful state of Vermont in the United States, because they had no protection for their groundwater, and they were having fights with some nuclear facilities and so on. And they not only said that they're going to protect their groundwater as a public trust, but they went further and said in times of any kind of dispute or shortage, it's very clear that water for daily living, for humans, human need, water for the ecosystem, and water for local food production is going to take priority, and everything else, it goes to the back of the line. Nothing else takes precedence, including those agribusinesses that are sucking up so much water to send exports abroad, basically sending your water abroad as well. So it's very important that we demand to know, and we hold our elected officials accountable for knowing what the state of water is and setting up those kind of priorities, because nothing is going to take the place of that kind of thinking. So what do we have to do? Well, rather than talk at you for too long, I'd really like to hear from you and have a conversation after. Basically, we're hoping to make water an election issue in this campaign. It's extremely important that we start talking about it as an issue that cross-cuts many others, from water justice and to public trust to privatization. We need a new water ethic in our world. We need a new water ethic here in Canada. The water ethic must say that everything we do, every practice, every policy must take into account its impact on water. And if the impact on water is not good, we have to say, go back to the drawing boards. It's not any longer okay to say water's not important, or it's just one of many factors that we don't have to worry about. If we cared about water, we wouldn't have biofuels. It takes 1,700 liters of water to produce 1 liter of corn ethanol. That's why the Ogallala Aquifer in the United States is dying. The U.S. Department of Agriculture says it'll be gone in our lifetime. And this is the aquifer that was bigger than Lake Huron. This is the aquifer that caused Obama to say no to Keystone Pipeline because it was going to endanger it. It's endangered now because they are growing massive amounts of industrial corn for corn ethanol. So we need to ask the question, when we're turning away from fossil fuels, which we need to do, what are we turning toward, and what is the impact on water? How do we trade across borders? Do we consider water? Do we consider the impact of water? When we import something from other countries, do we ask, what did that do to their water and their environment, or the human rights of their people, in bringing that product to us at a fraction of what we really should be paying for it? We're not asking those questions, and it's time that we ask these fundamental questions. One of the things that's lovely about water is that it really can inform any kind of discussion and any kind of movement, because it really, from environment to human rights to conservation to learning to share with one another, water is incredibly important to our lives. And I hope that we can build a water ethic based on the notion of water as a human right. And Alice talked about my being part of the getting the UN to recognize the human right to water. Since then, many, many nations have either amended their constitution to declare water a human right, or brought in new legislation. There have been court cases like the Kalahari Bushmen of Botswana, who'd been kicked out of the desert. They're basically hunter-gatherers. They've been thrown out of the desert because they'd found diamonds there, and they wanted to do diamond exploration and ecotourism. And so the people were put in these awful cement buildings, and the youth were very unhappy. There was a lot of alcoholism and suicide. So they came back into the desert, and they tried to establish their old way of life. So the government smashed their bore wells. And they made it illegal to even bring them water into the desert. This is their own government. And so they went to court. They got the right to go back to the desert, but did not get the right to water. But when the UN said water for basic needs is a human right, they went back to the highest court in Botswana and got the right to water confirmed. So, I mean, we have used this around the world. It really is a living, breathing document. But if we're moving in a direction where the supplies are going down or being destroyed, while at the same time there's a dramatic increase in demand, we are going to see more and more cases where governments, and this is already happening, decide water in favor of big industry, in favor of free trade zones, in favor of the economy, and not in favor of human rights. And so we really need to be vigilant and not assume in this country that these problems are not here. They're here. They're here in First Nations communities. They're here in inner cities in the United States, where, like Detroit, where hundreds of thousands of people have had their water cut off, mostly African American, mostly unemployed, left behind when the money left, and the million people and the money left in the last decade. This is happening all over the world now, and so we are one world, ready or not, when it comes to this issue. So I'm just going to end with my last thoughts from my book. It's actually called Last Thoughts, and it's a story. It's a story I love, and I think brings it home as much as anything I could share with you. 2 decades ago, I asked Oscar Oliveira, the leader of the first water war, what it was about water that inspired the kind of courage he and others had displayed in standing up to the army in his country. At the direction of the World Bank, Cochabamba, Bolivia allowed Bechtel to privatize and run its water services. The company tripled the price of water, making it too expensive for the majority of this largely indigenous, poor population. It even started fining people for capturing rainwater. That's true. They said, we own the rain, and if you're capturing it in cisterns, we're going to take it away or fine you. The people rose up against terrible odds. Many were hurt. Some were killed, but they did not back down, and Bechtel was forced to abandon Bolivia. Oscar was a shoemaker by trade and had never done anything like this in his life. But his anger at the injustice of this situation gave him a courage he didn't know he had. Why water, he said, knowing that I meant that there were many other terrible injustices his people, the Amira, had endured over time. Because, he said, water is life. Local water is personal, mine, ours. How dare they claim it for their faraway investors? And, he said, because I would rather die of I would rather die of a bullet than of thirst. I remember that conversation a decade later when I took a tour, my first tour of the tar sands in Alberta. Accompanying our group were some activists from the Athabasca Chippewan First Nation, which lives downstream from the site. Among them was a young leader named Mike Mercredi. At a press conference we held in Edmonton to describe what we saw and experienced on the tour, Mercredi tried to explain what life was like for his people. Sometimes, he said, you just look around and you say, where did all of this come from? Some nights when you're out there, out on the lake, or when you're out in the bush, when you look toward the south, you can actually see the lights glowing from industry, which tells us it's coming. It's coming towards us. The trees are gone and being cut. The land is upside down. We're no longer able to drink the water. We're covered with sores and cysts when we swim in it. He said that people were dying, including members of his family. And then he said it would be kinder to come in and kill them with guns than to do it this way. That's what reminded me of what Oscar Oliveira said. The water crisis is at our door here in Canada and in British Columbia. All the issues we thought were far away are upon us now. A greater challenge has never faced the people of Canada, a greater challenge for each and every one of us. Each and every one of us has a personal responsibility to take action, to collectively confront the very power structures that have prevented the change needed to protect and honor the great water heritage of this land. Future generations have the same rights as we to breathe clean air and drink clean water. Much rests on what we do now. Thank you so much.
We are so lucky to have Maud here, and we are so thankful that you came to see us. Maud is touring to promote the sale of her most recent book called Boiling Point: Corporate Abuse, Government Neglect, and Canada's Water Crisis. She will be signing copies of her book, which are for sale at one of the tables in the back. There are tables all around that represent the organizations that are responsible for putting on this forum tonight. And we hope that you will take the time to stop and see the work that's being done by the organizations here. There are a lot of petitions on the tables. My personal opinion is I'm tired of petitioning and asking. I'd like to start demanding, but that's just me. I won't ask you to do that. One of the things that's forthcoming is that on the 2nd of May, the Freshwater Alliance will be sponsoring an all-candidates meeting titled Vote for Water. It will be at the Stanhagen Theatre, North Island College, from 7 to 9, so put that on your calendars. We'll talk to you after our next two presenters about the index cards on your chair and what we would like you to do with them. The donations, any donations that you make tonight will be going to the Council of Canadians water campaigns and to help to support Maud's tour. Now I would like to introduce a speaker from the Canadian Freshwater Alliance. The Canadian Freshwater Alliance connects and builds freshwater communities across Canada. I've been fortunate enough to participate in some webinars that they've done and had the chance to talk with water leaders all over BC and learn some really good stuff about how to continue this work. The Freshwater Alliance is working to ensure all water in Canada is safe, clean, and accessible to all. And to speak to those issues, I would like to introduce Corey Tull, who is representing the Freshwater Alliance.
That's good. I like to talk with my hands, so it's better. They're free anyways. Can you hear me okay? Is that good? Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. It is an absolute pleasure to be here to join you tonight, but also what an opportunity to get to speak after Maud Barlow. I mean, I've grown up reading things about Maud, signing petitions, and following what the Council of Canadians is doing. So it's really a true honor to be here tonight. So thank you for those amazing words. I'd also like to thank the Comox territory for where we are today, the original stewards of the land and water. It's an honor to be able to speak to the challenges of water in this particular community. As Linda mentioned, my name is Corey Tull. I'm the organizing director with the Canadian Freshwater Alliance, and it's really great to be here. I'm excited tonight to speak to you about the current state of water challenges in our province, but more specifically about the Water Sustainability Act and how, what the Water Sustainability Act can do for us here in BC, and how it can be used as a critical shift from the old centralized approach to managing our water to one of partnership, shared risk, and responsibility among governments, communities, and First Nations rights holders. So in 2013, the Freshwater Alliance conducted public opinion polls across Canada around freshwater. And when we asked about the current conditions of freshwater in BC, 44% of respondents in BC said, yeah, water's in good health, it's great. So this was higher than any other province in Canada. So 44% in BC thought that it was great. We then asked, in 25 years, where do you think the water situation is going to be like in our country? So in 2038, and that number dropped to 21%. So people believe that 21% believe that I don't know, water might be okay. So that drop was one of the largest drops between now and the future of any province across Canada, was right here in British Columbia. So British Columbians are aware of water challenges increasing, yet they're not really seeing the same awareness being reflected in the actions that are being taken to protect our waters through government. And I think it speaks a bit to what Maud mentioned about the myth of abundance, in that we're starting to see some of these challenges and people are getting concerned, but we're not taking the action to actually implement some concrete regulations. So so every year we're seeing climate change bringing major water-related problems to BC, consecutive years of drought, unprecedented floods, and record low water levels in streams and rivers across the province. These trends compound ongoing concerns about diminishing groundwater levels and risks to our drinking water sources. In June 2016, residents of southern Vancouver Island experienced stage 4 drought for the second year in a row, and I'm sure many of you probably experienced that yourself. A June stage 4 drought is the earliest date a drought designation has ever been applied in BC. In the Thompson River, we continue to hear about declining steelhead runs, results of low water conditions, caused in part by diversions for agriculture and pollution from agricultural runoff and industrial development. In August 2014, as Maud mentioned, the tailings pond breach from the Mount Poly mine released 25 million cubic meters of toxic mining waste into creeks and rivers in the Quesnel River watershed. So just to put that in perspective, 25 million cubic meters, that's 10,000 Olympic swimming pools. It's a lot of toxic waste that went into that watershed. And then exactly 1 year later, conditional water permits were issued to Imperial Metals without long-term water management plans in place, and despite the ongoing complications that those communities continue to face from that same breach. The Steel Springs Waterworks District in the North Okanagan, it's where I grew up, has been under a do not drink advisory since March 2014. Nitrate levels in the Hulkar Aquifer, which lie beneath farm fields and provide drinking water to the residents of the Spalmachine area, have exceeded safe drinking water levels based on the Canadian Drinking Water Guidelines for the last 3 years. And right here in the Comox Valley, as you folks have experienced yourself, you're dealing with boil water advisories due to the sedimentation and turbidity, most likely attributed to the logging that's taking place. So these are just some of the escalating challenges across the province, but each of these issues demands urgent action from our province and from our federal government. Unlike other parts of the world, British Columbia perhaps still has some time to do things before we see widespread crisis across our province. All levels of government will be required to make difficult decisions about fresh water, but the bulk of responsibility truly will fall on our province. Now more than ever, we need to ensure that British Columbia's government will take action to protect waters we share and depend on. The Water Sustainability Act is an excellent and timely channel through which we can do this. So you might be asking, what is the Water Sustainability Act? Perhaps you know about the Water Sustainability Act, but in February 2016, Phase 1 of BC's Water Sustainability Act was brought into force. And this replaced the former 106-year-old Water Act. This enabled new approaches to modernizing water governance, planning, and management in our province. The Water Sustainability Act was a significant step in the right direction for improving the sustainability of water supplies and for protecting the ecosystems that our shared waters support. However, although the Act was passed and brought into force in 2016, there's some critical details of the legislation that need to be developed. This is because the way that the Water Sustainability Act was brought forward is that it's called an enabling legislation. And so what that means is it sets a framework for how water will be managed in our province and how it will be protected, but the details of what that will actually look like come through with following regulations. So, and those regulations were promised to come forward in the following years, but since that act came in, we haven't seen a commitment from our current government to actually follow through on bringing forward some of those regulations. So in the first phase of the Water Sustainability Act, when it came in, it was around groundwater regulations. And so they were the centerpiece for Phase 1. This means that industrial and agricultural users now need to apply for licenses for the first time in BC's history. I'd like to note that BC is the last province to regulate its groundwater, and many would probably argue that in the global north, it's one of the last places to regulate its groundwater. But there still are concerns around this new regulation and how that Phase 1 was brought in. The big one is around the lack of information and understanding of the relationship between groundwater and surface water, particularly in many watersheds here in BC. So groundwater diversions could have really big impacts on surface water and aquatic ecosystems. So the challenge, and I think as Maud mentioned, we've got people with blindfolds and straws and they're sucking out of their bathtubs, but the province is still giving out licenses and not really having a clear understanding of those impacts. And ultimately this results in licenses being granted today for streams that are potentially already over allocated, and these licenses are locked in for a 30-year time span, and it's hard to say what's going to happen over the next 30 years. So since the Act came into effect, those gaps to ensure legal protection for the health of our waters in BC are still there. The province has been slow to move on some of the critical elements, although they promised action on some of the key areas, like the review of water pricing. We've really heard radio silence from them, including additional funds to actually make the Water Sustainability Act function. In the most recent budget that came out just recently, there was no additional funds that were allocated to actually implement and move forward on the Water Sustainability Act. So these remaining regulations yet to be developed are critical in ensuring that the Act promotes sustainable stewardship of water, not just in name, but actually in substance. So that's why the Freshwater Alliance, along with 16 other environmental groups in the province, have put forward letters of expectations to the parties, as well as we've launched a campaign called Our Water BC. And what this is doing is it's calling on the provincial parties to incorporate key commitments to water protection and governance in their platforms before this upcoming election. And so we're asking for 4 really key pieces. And so we want to see water protected for nature and regulations. So this means sufficient and clean water flows for healthy ecosystems. This is referred to as environmental flows. And it's the cornerstone truly of water sustainability. Currently, the Water Sustainability Act provides new powers to protect aquatic ecosystems during times of water scarcity, but there's no legally binding protection for the environmental flow needs, and so the decisions are up to the discretion of provincial staff, but we don't necessarily have the data for them to make the informed decisions when it comes to these critical times on which areas they need to prevent water from continuing to be pulled from. The second thing that we want to see is meaningful co-governance with First Nations and involvement of local communities in decisions that affect their waters. So shared decision-making is vital to respecting First Nations' unique relationships to water and land in their territories and upholding their legal rights to be consulted and accommodated in decisions that impact their waters. The Act offers new opportunities for formal shared decision-making and watershed-based planning, but as we know in most policies, one size doesn't fit all. So it's really important that for good water governance that we have collaborative watershed level models and decisions that are taking place. So we're including local community members in those decisions that are directly going to impact them. The third piece is we want to see rigorous and transparent monitoring of water quality and quantity. So thousands of surface water licenses have been issued by the province over the past century, and over this time, there's been little to no monitoring of the actual water uses. Flows and the water needs of nature have often been ignored with these licenses have been issued. During the next 4 years, it's so important that the province allocate funds to actually build the capacity to collect, store, analyze, and report on the water quality and quantity within our province. And again, this goes back to we can't make good decisions if we don't have the information to be making these decisions. And the last piece that we're calling for is we really want to see adequate funding for implementation, including the actions on promised plans to review commercial water use pricing. So funding is required to effectively implement the Act, the Act's most promising features, and the additional phases that were promised. The data collection and management, we need to see increased capacity for education and outreach and compliance, enforcement, management. There's a lot of pieces that need to come into play in order for this Act to really give it the full teeth. So sufficient pricing is essential to support full cost recovery, which is critical to the success of water management in our province. So with these type of regulations still to be developed, we're in a period of unprecedented opportunity, I would like to think, to improve the way we manage our water in our province, and we need to ensure that our elected officials understand just how important these next steps are, and that it needs to happen sooner than later, and it needs to be made a priority right now during this election. So what can we do to make the Water Sustainability Act a priority for our next government? So in BC, as in the rest of Canada, groups working on freshwater issues tend to work independently of each other, developing their own messages around local issues, which can be really effective in your region. This approach can work to mobilize supporters on a specific campaign, but it doesn't necessarily shift a larger public discourse on public policy and freshwater protection in the province. So in order for regulations to be strong as possible, we need to ensure that decision makers in BC see that communities are connected and that there's strong and diverse public support for robust laws pertaining to water protection across the province. So to get public engaged in something as seemingly dry, pun intended, as regulations, we need to do a better job of talking about the Water Sustainability Act and how it connects to us as individuals and to the local issues. So if we talk about the details of the policy and regulations, we're not really potentially going to capture the public's imagination. But when we connect arguments about why particular aspects of the new regulations are important to the values that we share, we tap into a different part of identity of people living in British Columbia. So some examples of ways that we can tap into the values and speak to the issues around the Water Sustainability Act in this upcoming election. So some ideas around some of the values that we can speak to are around vitality. So we need water to live and be healthy and to thrive. Or we can tap into fairness, which is water is a human right, and it's unjust for people to not have equal access. Another potential option is prudence, so the idea that it's not right to be wasteful, even if something is abundant. And another example would be pride, so the belief that we have something unique and precious to the world, and therefore we have a responsibility to protect it. And this is a way that we can really start to connect with our neighbors and with our families and with our communities around bridging that gap between policy and actions in order to make water an issue. So when we combine these values with real on-the-ground threats each of you are working on, to address the narrative, we become even stronger. So great examples from 2015 when there's a grassroots group called the Water Wealth Project. Perhaps you've heard of it. They're based out of Chilliwack, and they were one of the big groups that discovered Nestle had been pulling millions of liters of water for free out of their aquifer. And so the group did a phenomenal job of really framing the story in a way that tapped into people's pride in the region of their home waters, a sense of fairness over access to water, and the Chilliwack First Nations' right to decide how water was used in their territory. The story made national and international news for weeks and finally came to a head when BC's Minister of Environment, Mary Pollock, was forced to publicly commit to reviewing water prices. So this is a great example of how tapping into our shared values can mobilize the public to put pressure on government. The caveat is that despite the minister's commitment to reviewing water prices, nothing has changed in over a year. So I have to put that in there. So Nestle's still paying $2.25 for 1 million liters of BC groundwater. And so this was past February was when the Minister of Environment had committed to having water prices reviewed, and we still haven't seen anything. So this election is a perfect time to put pressure on our government and let them know we are serious in wanting strong protection for water. So we have less than 40 days until May 9th, and together we have the power to truly defend our water and make it a priority for our next government. So we've got, I think Tuesday's when the writ drops, so you have till Tuesday to contact your MLA and email them, phone them, see if you can show up to their office and have a meeting and talk to them about why water is so important to you and your family and how you depend on it. Something I think that's really important that we can do right now in the election is reach out to our candidates that are running. It's so important that our candidates know the challenges that we're facing in our communities and what it means to you, because the more that we talk to the people that are running, and when they get elected, then that's the first thing that they can say is, you know what, I heard a lot about water during the election, and this is how we start to elect candidates and we start to get elected officials that truly understand the current crisis that we have in our province. We, as Linda mentioned, we've got the Water All Candidates meeting. We'd love to see you out there, but it's another opportunity to connect with your candidates, speak to them about the challenges and the issues that you're concerned about, and to really hear where they stand, so that we're electing those champions into government that are going to continue to drive forward and push policies that we need right now. And I truly believe that we have the opportunity right now to move heads, to move hearts, and to truly move policy at the same time. So I hope you'll join me as we unite our voices and we ensure that water is a critical conversation during the upcoming election, and it remains on the agenda for our newly elected government in May. At the back of the room afterwards, the Freshwater Alliance, we have a pledge, and so if anybody pledges to vote for water, we've provided a survey to all of the parties that we will send back to you that outlines where all of the parties stand on water policy in our province, so that when you go to vote, you've got that extra bit of detail in your back pocket so you can make an informed decision around water policy, so we can continue to hold our government accountable after May 9th to ensure that we get a robust and successful Water Sustainability Act put into place. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Corey, for leading us into the dry area of the Water Sustainability Act, which is incredibly important for us right now here in this province. Our next speaker is David Stapley. who I'm very pleased to add to this conversation. He works with the Comox Valley Land Trust as the program manager for the Comox Valley Conservation Partnership. The partnership is made up of 22 local environmental and ratepayers groups. And he is, personally, has been an advocate for conservation issues. He believes in working collaboratively with local governments for improved land use practices, stronger environmental regulations, and a greater voice for the stewardship groups in land use and decision making. He's also sits as a member of the Comox Valley Regional District Comox Lake Watershed Advisory Committee. And this brings many of the discussion, you know, Maud's discussion and Corey's discussion right home to us about our water and what's happening with our water right now. So David, thank you. We're going to reorganize ourselves up here a little bit. We're going to bring the screen down so the panelists, if you want to watch the presentation, maybe you want to come down and...
Yeah, while we get things organized here, because I'm not quite as dynamic speaker as the last two, and I require electronic props to keep me going. So here's, we're going to move into the Think Globally, Act Locally section of the program tonight. And I'm going to be talking to you tonight about the state of health of the Comox Lake watershed. And then we're going to have a little thought process in terms of where do we want to go with protecting our watershed in the future. All right, so let's get started here. So the first thing I'd like to do is get the computer to work. So, Corey?
Screen down more.
This is working, so we'll use this. Okay, that's good. Let's keep it there. Okay, so why don't we get started with some basic watershed facts. The drinking watershed that we all drink out of is Comox Lake. It provides water for 50,000 residents in the Comox Valley on 2 different water systems. There's the Comox Valley Regional District Water System that services Courtenay and Comox. And then there's the Village of Cumberland's water system that services about 4,000 or 5,000 residents. We are very fortunate to have a huge watershed, 461 square kilometers. We have a lake that's 2,100 hectares in size and is averaging 65 meters in depth. The land in the watershed is about 1/3 in Strathcona Park, so it's a protected public land. The other 2/3 almost entirely is made up of private forest lands. There is a small percentage of land that has park and some private land as well. People living on it in the village of Cumberland. We also have many recreational users. We have a reservoir that's operated by BC Hydro. The water quality in the lake is excellent. And at this point in time, our water, it comes through unfiltered water services. So let's have just a quick look at the map here to see where we are, get better oriented. So this black line is the outline of the watershed. This is Comox Lake. Puntledge River that flows into Courtenay is here. The village of Cumberland is approximately over here. The high elevation areas in the watershed that are in Strathcona Park are in the green areas here. It's about 1/3 of the watershed. And the rest of, most of these tan areas and this darker brown area here, these are all private forest lands. 60% of the private forest land, 60% of the watershed is owned by one landowner, Timber West, and the other 5% is owned by Hancock Logging. And then the other 1%, Village of Cumberland, Fish and Game Club, whatnot. So our watershed, if we start looking at it, what does it look like on the ground? We start at the high elevation areas in Strathcona Park. Well, obviously it's very beautiful, but if you look at the watershed, you can see it's at the high levels, it's basically rock, snow, ice, some lakes and tarns. When the snow melts and when the rain comes down, the water rushes off these areas. There's very few soils, very few trees, and it enters into the forested valleys of the watershed. This is where the private forest lands are. And you can see the valleys in the watershed are very steep. And you can see that there's lots of evidence of logging. And the soils in the higher parts and the steep slopes are very thin. And the valley bottoms where there's more soil aren't very large. It's looking at the water and then flows into the lake. This is looking east from the mouth of the Crookshank River towards, out towards Courtenay and Cumberland. Even around the lake, you can see that the slopes are quite steep. So we have to remember that when it rains or when the snow melts, the water moves very quickly, and it's what we call a high energy watershed. There are 10 tributaries that flow into Comox Lake. The largest of these is the Crookshank. Almost half the water that flows into Comox Lake comes from the Crookshank River system. You can see in this photograph that there's been quite a lot of logging activity, historical logging and current logging. Most of the logging that occurs in the watershed now is second growth, though there's still old growth logging occurring. So let's talk a little bit about water quality. Water, and we'll look at quality and quantity. There's many other values and important environmental features about our watershed, but tonight I'm just going to focus on the drinking water quality of the source water. So we got to look at quantity and quantity when we're looking at drinking water. And so let's start with quantity. Then we're talking about the water that flows into the lake, and it comes in the form of precipitation, which varies throughout the year. In the winter, we have snow and rain. In the springtime, we have snow melt and rain. The summer, we have glacier melt, a little bit of rain from any summer storms you might get, and of course a lot of infiltration. That's the water that's under the ground and subsurface that flows more slowly into the creeks. And then in the fall, whatever rain we might get, and then a little bit of glacier melt. We put this on a graph. You can see on the left-hand side of the graph is your volume of water, and on the bottom, starting from January going through to December, you can see that the water flows in heavy quantities starting in October and November when the rains start to come, and you can see how the inflows rise quickly because we have a very steep slope watershed, and it stays quite high through the winter, through winter rains, and stays high and starts to drop off in the spring when the snow melts. And typically, it starts to level off, and the inflows decline slowly, starting at the beginning of July until we get our first rains in October. If we look at our water consumption, it's actually the opposite. Our water consumption starts to rise in April, May, when we start to sprinkle and irrigate, and peaks in August, September, and then quickly drops back down October, November. So if we put the inflow and the water demand on the same graph, you can see that at sometime historically to this point, sometime around the beginning of July, the end of June, the inflows into the lake meet the demand, and after that in the summer and up into the fall until we get our first heavy rains, there's a gap, what I like to call the water demand gap. We do have a reservoir in our water system that BC Hydro operates, and this is where we draw water down. The reservoir is 13 meters deep and the full 2,100 hectares size of the lake. So there's quite a lot of water, and that's slowly drawn down over the summer to meet that gap. So the other thing we need to be thinking about is quality. So when you're looking at water quality in our local watershed, you think about pathogens and sediments. We have E. coli bacteria, which is quite normal to occur in any watershed, and viruses such as Cryptosporidium. Sediments that are typical in our watershed are gravel, sand, and fine glacial clays. We look at the E. coli sources. Now, I don't want to alarm anyone because, again, E. coli is naturally occurring in all watersheds, the levels that we have in Comox Lake are very low and are easily treated by chlorine. But it's worth to know what are the sources of E. coli in our watershed? Well, the highest source of E. coli is from black bears, and most of the other sources are from other wild animals that naturally occur in the watershed. Human source of E. coli is the second highest contributor, but again, the levels are actually quite low, and with simple chlorination treatment, the water quality is quite fine to drink. Sedimentation, and why is sedimentation a water quality issue? Well, because sediments in the water can interfere and do interfere with water treatment. So we've a lot of talk lately in the papers when we have our boil water advisories about the turbidity levels. In our watershed, we be aware that the turbidity or the sediments are non-organic sediments which do not carry bacteria or viruses in them. The sources from these sediments come from stream erosion, logging roads, and slides. And the real only problematic sediments that we have as far as drinking water goes is the fine clay sediments, because these sediments are so light and they're actually electrically positively charged that they don't settle. After, when the rain ends, the brownish water that has the gravels and the sand in it, they settle very quickly to the bottom of the lake. The clay particles, they stay suspended in the lake, and until they're flushed out naturally, they just persist. And that is why we've had these long boil water, one of the reasons why we've had the long boil water advisories. So I want to now look at what I think are two of the main factors that affect the water quality and quantity in our watershed. And one of them is climate change, and the other is land use, and we're going to start with climate change. The climate is definitely changing in our watershed. The rising temperatures is affecting our snowpack, and it's also affecting longer summer drought periods in the summertime. So we have a less frequent rainfall, and this of course is leading to lower summer flows than we've had historically, and of course it creates water restrictions. A good way to look at how climate change is impacting our watershed is to look at the impact of higher temperatures and lower snowfalls on the Comox Glacier. This is a photograph that was taken on the same day in September from the same location 3 years in a row, 2013, 14, and 15, and you can see quite dramatically how the glacier is receding. And remember that our summer inflows, one of the sources is from glacier melt. Some of the glacier scientists are predicting that the Comox Glacier may disappear anywhere from, I've heard, from 5 to 20 years. So we may not have a glacier in 20 years, providing us with some of our inflows in the summer. So when you look at the inflow into the lake and our water use, you can see that with climate change, what's going to happen is that point where the pink and green lines intersect, which have been typically around the end of June, is more likely to start in May or April, and obviously last longer. The pink line where the inflows is going to actually drop down and be less water flowing into the lake. So this water demand gap is going to grow if we do not deal with our water use. So water conservation is definitely something we have to be thinking about. We have only been talking about the human use of water. I know Corey mentioned the Water Sustainability Act is finally we got some policies around environmental flow. Well, the environmental flows in Comox Lake affect the Puntledge River system. And in the last few years, we've had a number of times in late summer where the minimum flow required to maintain healthy fish populations and other aquatic species has dropped below the 13 cubic meters per second level. And we've had some negative impacts on our salmon populations in the Puntledge Rivers as a result. So this, if we don't want this to continue in the future, we're going to have to start looking at our consumption level of how much water we use. The other thing, climate change, is more frequent and intense winter storms. This photograph shows you the satellite image of a Pineapple Express hitting our coast. That was the first one we had in October 2016. We've had 4 this year. And we've had 4 boil water advisories that follow them. So this is going to be the pattern into the future. The BC Climate Change Consortium out of UVic is estimated that in 25 to 50 years, we will probably be experiencing 10 to 12 more of these Pineapple Express extreme weather events. And this year we've had 4, so you can imagine if we added 10 to 12 more, what the impacts are going to be on our watershed. What does it look like on the ground? Well, here is what the Cruikshank River outlet looked in December 2014 when we had our first long boil water advisory. That was what was called a 1 in 60 year rainfall event. And you can see how the sediments are coming out of the lake, into the lake from the river, and that the color of the lake is that kind of white clay silt that persists in the lake, and it took quite a long time to clear out. The other thing we want to talk about is land use. The primary land use in the Comox Lake watershed is logging. And logging has been occurring in the watershed starting in the 1900. It was really in full gear by 1930. Historical logging practices, of course, didn't have any environmental regulations whatsoever. All the old growth cedar and fir trees in the valley bottoms in the watershed and all along the lake were all logged. When they did logging up the Cruikshank, and all around the valley at that time, machines and logs would be dragged through creeks. There was no buffers around streams. One of the practices that I found out about when I sat on the Watershed Advisory Committee was they used to fell trees all along the creeks, and then they would build a dam, a temporary dam, raise the level, and then they would blast the temporary dam, and so all the logs would flow down the creek into the lake, so they wouldn't have to build a road. So that was back in the day when we thought, environment was endless, trees were endless, and we didn't have to think about protecting anything. So between 1900 and 1950, all these old growth trees in our valley bottoms and along the lake have been removed. And you can see this today pretty much in any watershed. You go for a walk in the Comox Valley, you'll see these old cedar trees, old fir stumps sitting in creeks. This is all the root systems that used to hold the banks in place, of course, have rotted away. And you can see how the erosion has occurred in those streams. Of course, logging continues today. This is a photograph that was taken in the upper Cruikshank area in 2015. And the large-scale clear cutting that occurs in our watershed, it still continues today. Most of the logging, as I said, was the second growth, though there's still old growth being cut higher up in the higher elevation areas and way back at the end of the tributaries. One thing that trees do in our watershed is a fully mature Douglas fir tree will take care of 25 to 35% of runoff through intercepting the water and transpiration over the course of a year. So when you log large areas like this, 25 to 30% more runoff will occur. And it takes quite a long time for that trees, or the replanted trees, to grow up. So maybe in 20 years, you're getting maybe 15 to 20% more runoff. And it takes 60, 70, 80 years before your trees are back to functioning by capturing that runoff. And if you think about the clear cutting that's occurring throughout the watershed over the last, say anywhere from 40, 50 years to today, has diminished the capacity of those forests to reduce the runoff. So basically what's happening as far as the hydrology of the watershed, based on this level of cutting, and we're down to like 50-year rotations now, that more runoff is occurring. Remember, we're in a steep slope watershed, so that water runs quickly into, more water runs quickly into the creeks, creates more flow, more erosion, more sediments go into our lake, and the amount of clay silts in our watershed that cause the boil water advisories is going to happen more. So when you combine, well, apparently we're getting questions later, so I'm going to talk a little bit. Well, we have the Private Forest Land Manage Act, which governs the private forest lands. The regulations are not as stringent as in public lands. They do have, for example, riparian buffers are required to be 15 meters on private lands, but in public lands, typically it's 30 meters. That's just one example. Anyway, I haven't got a lot of time, so I've got to keep moving here before I get booted off the stage. If we look at the lower Crookshank in September 2015 after in a drought period, and then 10 months before in that 60-year heavy flood from the 1 in 60-year event, you can see the difference in the quality and the quantity. One other land use we should talk about in our watershed is a diversion that was put in 1972 by the village of Cumberland to increase the capacity of their water supply system. This area that was approved by the province, by the Ministry of the Environment, to do this. And this area was not actually natural drainage. And so you look at that cut block, that cut bank, that has all been eroded away in the last 50 years. I stood on that bank. It's 50 feet deep. It varies from 10 feet to, say, 100 feet across. It's a kilometer long. And all that sediment has been washed down in Perseverance Creek. And those fine clay particles, which will not settle, eventually end up in the lake when you have a heavy rain event. This is what Perseverance Creek looked like on December 2014. So where are we now? And that's a good question. Well, I think our watershed, despite the challenges of climate change and despite the logging we've had, we still have very good quality water in our watershed, except for when we have these extreme weather events. And even then, you can see the color of the water at the end of those creeks. And they can measure, they have an NTU as a measurement. They might be as high as 45 NTU. But when you go to the intake pipe, they're between 1 and 2 NTU. So the lake is like a big sponge. It's like a big natural filter. And what we need to do, in our opinion at the Comox Valley Land Trust, is we need to be focusing our attention and our resources on restoration and protection of our watershed. What are the areas that we need to protect? What areas can be restored so we can get the creeks functioning in their proper condition so that the quality of water in the lake is protected and improved over time. What we're facing now is a requirement for filtration and a deep water intake. It's $110 billion that our taxpayers in Comox and Courtenay have to foot this bill. $45 million is for a filtration plant. Now, the filtration plant will not deal with the sediment or the E. coli in the watershed. What it will do is it will, before the water goes into your pipe, into the water system, it's going to be filtered and treated. So it's not really dealing with the causes. It's just dealing with the symptoms. And I think those resources would be better spent since we don't really have a serious problem at this point. Remember, our E. coli can be dealt with easily with chlorination. It's the sedimentation. The sediments in our watershed become the boil water advisories have occurred because the regulations and standards were changed in 2014. Up until then, we didn't have boil water advisories despite having the same level of turbidity in our drinking water. But the regulations changed and became very super precautionary. And I don't see the evidence that we have a health problem. We don't see the hospitals filling up with people with gastrointestinal diseases or health issues after during boil water advisories. The regional district tests the water during every boil water advisory, and not one sample has ever come in through the system that shows that there is a risk to health. However, this is a requirement that the provincial government is saying our community must invest this money in this infrastructure. And I think it's actually the wrong way to go. Many communities around the world, and certainly in BC, Vancouver and Victoria, they decided they'd buy their watershed and manage their watershed. So, and it's happening in many places in the world, and we don't have time to get into those examples. But I think really we've got to, as a community, we need to stop and just think about what we're doing and what direction do we want to do. We've heard about, really how lucky we are to be living in the Comox Valley with the water that we have, the amount of water we have, and the quality of the water, and we really want to protect that in the future. The BC government has a lot of tools at its disposal. One of them is to have higher standards for forest practices. You know, they can do it. They've done it in Clayoquot Sound. They've done it in the Great Bear Rainforest. Why can't we do it in our drinking watershed? They could institute. They could use the tools that Corey was talking about with the Water Sustainability Act, making sure that environmental flows are maintained. Our local governments, now we should be really proud of our local governments because they've already taken the first step. They've put together a watershed protection plan and are actually spending money to implement it. We are now have, just as of September, October, we now have 10 monitoring sites throughout the watershed, and this is going to tell us, pinpoint what the turbidity, any water quality and quantity issues. We're going to have the data. If we don't have that data, we can't make good decisions. We can't manage our watershed. They set up the Watershed Advisory Group, which I sit on. Now it's a voluntary group. It doesn't have teeth because local governments don't have a lot of powers because they sit in a senior government's hands. But at least we sit at the table with landowners, the ministry, provincial ministries, federal ministries, and the local governments to try to come up with some solutions. And finally, the Comox Valley Land Trust. The Comox Valley Land Trust is just starting a project to identify land protection options for Comox Lake and try to put together a business case as to why it's worth investing in those things. And I'm going to stop there because I better get off the stage, right? Thank you.
I want to thank David very much. I've had the good fortune to work with him over the years in some of the work that's being done by the Land Trust and the Conservation Partnership. And I think we're ahead of the game, more ahead of the game than many other communities to have somebody of that quality working in our favor. Our local governments listen to what the Land Trust and the Conservation Partnership has to say. Now I'm going to tell you about those index cards. We would like you to use one of your index cards to write any questions that you have for the panelists. At the top, would you indicate which panelist you are referring your question to? And when you've written your question, you can hold it up, and we've got runners who will come along. And no, we don't have runners? Oh, no. Yes, we have runners. Barb? Oh, Barb's got some already. So one index card is for questions for the panelists, and one index card is for the burning question that you would ask a person that you would vote for in the May 9th election, a question for all of the candidates. What is the most important question for you? And those questions can be dropped off at the Freshwater Alliance table. They have the last table at the end here with the black banner and the green logo. So we're going to take 15 minutes for questions, 10 minutes for questions. We're running a little behind schedule, but not too much. And the questions that you're doing for the local candidates will be used for the Candidates Forum on Water on the 2nd of May. Vote for water. So do we have some questions for the panelists right now? Do our runners are collecting questions. Just hold them up. And also there's information on every seat. There was a list of questions that you might consider asking for your candidates, and there's a list of things that you can do on the back side of that sheet. Water questions for candidates, and here's what you can do.
Questions? 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 Do you have a card? Yep, right in the back of that one. Oh, yeah, I'm supposed to read them. Yeah. There's a question on that one, so maybe just write it on the one that you have there, and I'll send you something. I'll get you another card. So if you do that, questions? Okay.
First question is for David. Are there ways that the Water Sustainability Act could help with local shared governance of our drinking water? Our drinking wetland.
Watershed, maybe?
Watershed. Watershed.
Well, maybe Corey might want to weigh in on this as well. The Water Sustainability Act is mostly policy, doesn't have the regulations, but in the policy there's a little section there that says that the provincial government can create local watershed authorities. So that is one thing that I would love to see happen. I think that for that to happen, I think governments, local communities have to ask the provincial government to create one of those watershed authorities. None of them have ever been done yet that I know of in BC. And there are other things that maybe you're more aware of, Corey, in terms of environmental flows. Can you say anything about that, about the environmental flow policies to maintain environmental flows?
Yeah.
Okay.
Was the question specifically about
Water Act.
just
Water Act, Sustainability Act.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I'm not sure what the question was about, specifically about the flows though?
No, I was just thinking that the environmental flow policies could be beneficial to maintaining the watershed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, local communities are seeing firsthand the challenges of impacts to flows, and I think a great example to that is in the Cowichan, where there were volunteers literally carrying salmon upstream because there wasn't enough water for them to get upstream to spawn. And so that feeds right back into having local communities working hand in hand to help develop the policies that directly impact their communities. And in the letter of expectations that the Freshwater Alliance, along with the other organizations, sent to all of the parties, one of the pieces that we put in there was asking that in the next 4 years we have, I think it was a minimum of 4 communities that we actually start this watershed process with them, so that we can start to develop these on-the-ground models and see how they work.
This is a question for Maud, and I can't read one of the words, so perhaps the author of this question could stand and repeat it. Is grapevine perhaps more viable than desalination? Graphene? She's not answering that question, not able to answer that question. Most of the questions are for David, considering the fact that it's our watershed, it's likely. How would you go about buying a watershed? Would Timber West consider selling their land at a going rate? What does it cost to buy a watershed? Why do we, oh, okay, that's.
Well, I don't know what it's going to cost to buy the watershed. But we need to, first of all, besides a willing seller, you also need to have a willing purchaser. And I think that as community members, we need to start asking our local governments to say, and our provincial government, which is requiring us to spend this money on filtration, is this really the best use of these funds? Would it be not better to invest it in purchasing our watershed? So I don't have the cost, but we're already looking at having to spend $110 million for man-made water infrastructure in the next few years in our watershed. So I don't have the answer to that, but I do know it has happened, and other communities have bought them, and maybe you don't buy the watershed. There's other ways you can protect the land. You can come up with creative agreements with the landowners. You could still allow, I believe you could still allow some forestry and logging in the watershed, just done at a completely different scale. And we need to be valuing the other assets. There are recreational assets, but there's also the value of maintaining the hydrology in the watershed. What's that worth to us, and what's that worth to our community? Is it worth more than the lumber that's being taken out? It's a good question. That's one of the things we're going to try looking at on our land protection options project, is to actually look at some of these questions and what's the economic values in the watershed.
Thanks, David. This question is for Maud. Comox Valley water includes Oyster River. BC government issued a permit to Quinsam Coal to explore for coal at the Oyster River. Is drinking water for 6,500 residents of the Comox Valley. Please take return with province to say no to coal in Oyster watershed. Okay, this one's for you too, Maud. What exactly can we do? What exactly can we do to make water a human right and add it to our Constitution?
Well, two thoughts to that. One is that I know you live in British Columbia, and when you think water, you think about the British Columbia government and local governments here, but I really urge everybody here to also have your sights set on the federal government, because the water is a shared responsibility between the federal and provincial governments. And it's a very intricate kind of game in a way, a dance in a way that they play. Over the decades, successive federal governments have given away their part of the responsibility, and we really need them to be taking it back. There is a very important role for the provincial government here, but please don't let the Trudeau government off with the promise, what might be a broken promise, that they would reinstate these 3 water acts, because there is nothing provincially that replaces what has been lost at the federal level. The Fisheries Act, the Navigable Waters Protection Act, and the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act are basically gutted, and we need them back. So I just want to take this opportunity of grabbing the floor to make this plea to you that you think provincially, but we don't just say, oh, well, the federal government's gone, and we're not going to demand that they come back. This is a recipe for disaster, because we're just, the provinces are just signing a new interprovincial free trade agreement, which might sound really terrific. Doesn't that make sense, having similar regulations? But they're going to start giving corporations and private sector interests in one province the right to sue a government of another province if they think they're being untreated fairly. Just like just like in NAFTA, just like in CETA, we're setting up a competitive kind of situation and a race to the bottom. And if you don't have strong federal laws to protect our environment or protect human rights, we're going to find they lower in all the provinces. So I just really want to place that out to you. I would like to see our Constitution include the human right to water, and we support the Suzuki and other project, the Blue Dot project, to have environmental health placed in the Constitution as well, or if they don't want to reopen the Constitution, to bring in separate law on what that would mean. And of course that means mostly in our country, First Nations. And it's very important, I think, for you to know that it was the Canadian government, not just the Harper government, but governments before that, that did not support the human right to water. And Canada was the last country in the world, this was still under Stephen Harper, to formally recognize the human right to water, much to our shame, it should be. And so we really have some catch up to do, and I really want us to think about what it means here in Canada, about how we could use our political tools and the UN to promote the water justice, not charity, water justice around the world. And that means our mining companies, when they're misbehaving and dumping their toxins and poisoning people in other countries, have to be held accountable. And so we have a responsibility back here not to allow that to happen.
I just got permission to add something from Maud. How many people here are stewardship members of stewardship groups in the Valley? I see quite a few out there. So anybody wants to know how important those federal regulations like the Department of Fisheries and Oceans acts are, go talk to anyone in this room. They all know.
Corey has something to say.
Just to build off of what Maud was saying around the Fisheries Act and Navigable Waters Act, there are conversations that are happening right now about how they can be improved. But I think something really important that's worth going to your member of parliament and speaking to them about is saying, let's get those acts back up to where they were before all of those cuts took place, and then let's look at what we need to do to get it better. But if we sit around and wait until the improvements happen, our lakes are still unprotected. And so let's get those protections put in place, and then let's look at where we can take it to the next step, which is what they're from. Yeah.
We're going to have to cut the question period short. I'm going to read 2 more questions, and then I promise that I will write all of these questions down and send it to our local newspaper so that you can read what everybody asked. This one is for Maud. Do you agree that charging Nestle more would turn water into a commodity? Would charging more be a good or bad move? Would it not be better to revoke the license?
Yeah, we have to have this dialogue about how much industry pays for raw water. That's separately from the question of bottled water. When we hear about, water shouldn't be free, we need to charge more, what a lot of business school type people are saying is that you and I have to pay more for the service charges, but we residential users and small business users only use about 9%. We're only responsible for about 9% of water use. Most of it is big raw water users, the big agribusiness, the hydroelectricity, and so on. And that's mining. Those are the discussions that we have to have when they are accessing this water. Why is it so cheap? So that's a question. But then when you get specifically to bottled water, we have to ask the question that should they have access to it at all? My answer is no. If we have clean, accessible public water coming out of our taps, there is no reason for us to be giving away this precious water to be put in plastic and sent around the world. Do you know that the industry says that by 2020, in just 3 years, they will be producing 465 billion liters of water a year? I mean, it's really growing exponentially. It's growing in places like China and India and Brazil, where there's a new middle and wealthy class, and where the water coming out of the taps is not safe to drink. So we really have to have a mindset here that this is not a good use of our water. It promotes privatization. It promotes plastic garbage, enough to go to the moon and back something like 100 times if you put them end to end. It's just not a good use of our water. And it sets a mindset that, well, why would I want to pay for public water if I'm taking my money and putting it into private water? So I think they're kind of 2 different things that we need to think of. In the province I live in, Ontario, they're talking about moving from $3.71 per million liter to 500, and they think that's going to satisfy us. But I think we have to say no. There's no place. The water is not endless. That groundwater is precious, and this is not a good use of it.
The last question, and I'm going to address it to all 3 of you. What are we doing to reach the younger generation?
Sure. I'm happy to start. Well, I like to think of myself as a young person, although I did just have a baby, so suddenly I feel like I'm like a full-blown adult. So, so I feel like I'm in a little bit of a shift. But I think when we, as I mentioned before, when we start to talk about like values and how do we connect these issues to what really matters to us, and I think that crosses generational boundaries, anyways. But I think we start to engage young people in these conversations and allowing them to really comprehend and understand the challenges ahead of us. And I think a lot of young people are seeing this firsthand across the board, whether these are environmental challenges or just social challenges, that life is harder now than it was, I think, for our parents. And we're seeing it. And I'd like to challenge the fact that millennials don't care and they're lazy and all of this, because I'm a millennial and I'm here and I'm informed and I'm working hard, and I know that there's lots of other folks out there that feel the same way, and I think we just need to continue to engage in conversation with them and with young folks, and continue to reach an arm out and say, please come and join me, let's do this together.
I very much agree, and I would add that I think a really good entree is the bottled water issue, because young people get it. They drink bottled water. I was one high school where the kids collected all the plastic bottles that were sold in the restaurant and or the cafeteria and the vending machines for a month. And then they put them end to end, and they went around the gymnasium and out into the halls and out around the block. And they invited the media and they invited parents and so on. And it was an incredibly powerful learning experience for all of us to look at this. This is 1 month in one little school. So when you have that kind of knowledge or that kind of interaction, I think it's very powerful. But I remember I do a lot of speaking with young people, and this sweet young guy, maybe 13, got up and he had his bottle of water and he said, "Oh, God, I hear you, miss. Oh my God, I hear you." Right? But he said, why did you get around without bottled water before? And I said, well, this is going to sound really strange to you, but once upon a time, people left their homes without water on them. Now, they rushed to a place where there was water, like a drinking water fountain or a restaurant. They had to hurry because for 5 minutes they didn't have water on them, right? It's like, it's just such a mindset that we have now that you have to have this stuff with you all the time. And so I think it's a wonderful opportunity to then talk to kids about them. What about when you don't have access to clean water, and what is it like? And what might it be like for a child to, more kids die of waterborne disease than all forms of violence in our world put together, including war. So there's an entree there, but I think you start with where the kids are, and that is with the discussion. And why not get them banning bottled water in their schools or promoting public water or whatever? When you give them something positive to do, they love it. And I just think that we need to train a whole new generation of water warriors.
I'm a member of the Comox Valley Conservation Partnership. There's 22 groups, and several of those groups go into the schools and do direct environmental education. I know Project Watershed does, and the Solon River Restoration Society, which is great. We had an event here. I don't know how many people were here last 2 weeks ago. We had a eco-asset symposium. They weren't all gray-hairs in the room. There was quite a mixture of people of all ages. And then we had workshops the following day, and again we had it was more professional oriented, but we had people that were under 40, so that's great. So I think that young people don't like going to meetings, and then we're kind of used to that, so we need to be doing outreach in other ways.
Thank you, panel. Before we close the evening, I would like to ask Tina Filipino to come and join us and to send us on our way using our voices and to kind of just get us up off our seats a little bit and ready to go out there and rock the world. Yes, you can have it.
So join me in the radical act of community singing.